So Attlee came to Washington. Okay, well, how'd that go? Well, at least he's going to continue helping. Sorry. Look, come on, be clement with me. Hello? I thought it was funny. December 10th, 1950. UN forces are in full retreat. In the span of 2 weeks, the discussion has turned from how long it will take them to occupy the whole of Korea to whether they can even stay there at all. This week, everyone's attention shifts to the elephant in the room, something that President Truman himself has confirmed. The U.S. is considering all responses to the Chinese assault, including an atomic bomb. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week we saw brutal fighting in both East and West. 8th Army had to pull back to avoid total encirclement, and that retreat quickly turned into a rout. 10th Corps began concentrating around Hamhung and Hungnam as the Marines stuck in the Chosin Reservoir worked their way south towards safety. And as this week gets going, the excuses for the disasters are flooding out of Tokyo. In fact, there is something more insidious than arrogance or hubris haunting UN Commander Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. Madness. MacArthur is struggling to come to terms with what he's hearing from the ground. He does not visit Korea this week, instead choosing to seclude himself in his Tokyo headquarters, surrounded by his staff and by his delusions. Yep. Communications out of Tokyo this week become progressively more fanciful and detached from reality. MacArthur begins by refusing to acknowledge that the Marines at Chosin are in a fight for their lives. He instead insists they are conducting an offensive action which is tying down 2 or 3 Chinese armies, which would otherwise be hammering 8th Army. He angrily rejects any notion that his forces have been routed, instead chastising journalists for not knowing the difference between a planned withdrawal and a military defeat. Almost following the stages of grief to the letter, MacArthur moves on to bargaining. He suggests that the advance by 8th Army has forced the hand of the Chinese, provoking them into attacking early. This is a far better outcome than waiting until they came of their own accord. At least he's forced them to fight on his own terms and not handed them the initiative. So in a way, that's kind of a success, right? Nobody's buying it. In truth, MacArthur simply cannot bear to see his legacy being stained before his eyes, but he really has nobody to blame but himself. Suddenly, he looked to outsiders, even those who bore him some measure of goodwill, like an old man hopelessly out of touch. The British General Leslie Mansergh, who visited him in Tokyo then, observed that he appeared to be much older than his 70 years. Signs of nerves and strain were apparent. He seemed to Mansergh completely disconnected from the battlefield reality. What started as a failure on the battlefield is rapidly turning into a crisis of command. MacArthur slips further into self-pity and despair, not paying active attention to events in Korea and instead brooding in his headquarters and bickering with journalists and subordinates. If some would argue he should have been relieved of command by now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proved to be equally impotent. They watched the tragedy unfold and read MacArthur's increasingly unhinged cables with bemusement, tutting and shaking their heads in disbelief, but they don't actually do anything. 8th Army is still in headlong retreat, and that does not change this week. By the start of the week, 8th Army Commander Walton Walker's forces have had their capabilities reduced by about half. ROK's 2nd Corps, ROK is the South Koreans, is now basically out of the fight. The divisions that were scattered by the Chinese a couple of weeks ago have reformed at about half strength, but they will not be risked in combat against the Chinese a third time. U.S. 2nd Division and the Turkish Brigade, both mauled last week, are out of action too. The UN forces do still have a fighting chance on paper, though. 4 new ROK divisions have been activated in the south since the breakout from the Pusan perimeter in September. They're fighting North Korean guerrillas, but could be redeployed up north. More international troops are arriving too, including battalion-sized units from Thailand, the Philippines, the Netherlands, and France. The reality, though, is that these ROK divisions are even less capable and reliable than the ones that were torn apart in hours by the Chinese, and the international forces arriving at Pusan are not large or strong enough to make a meaningful difference. Walker knows he can only really call upon the units that have served him thus far. The U.S. 24th, 25th, and 1st Cavalry Divisions, the ROK 1st Division, and the British 27th Commonwealth Brigade. This, plus the British 29th Infantry Brigade, which has now moved up in support, is all the strength Walker has, at least for now. But this is not going to be enough to hold their current positions, especially with Ned Almond's 10th Corps concentrating around Hamhung and Hungnam in the east. The gap between them and 8th Army is too large, and Walker's fears that the Chinese mean to exploit it seemed to be confirmed at the end of last week, December 2nd, when aerial recon reported Chinese troops to his east moving to outflank him. There is nothing else for it. Pyongyang will have to be abandoned. On December 3rd, last day of last week, the order was given, and 8th Army begins pulling back at the start of this week. By December 5th, they're formed up along a line 10 to 15 kilometers south of Pyongyang, with U.S. 1st Corps manning the Pyongyang front and 9th Corps fanning out east to cover the right flank. It's unlikely that they can stay here either, and Walker orders his men to be ready for another withdrawal 50 kilometers southward. The withdrawal from Pyongyang is messy, though. Huge stocks of equipment and supplies were brought up in preparation for the ill-fated offensive, and now anything that cannot be quickly loaded and carried out on trucks has to be destroyed. With almost no enemy contact, Walker's forces moved south of Pyongyang within 24 hours. Much of the city was afire by 7:30 a.m. on the 5th of December, when the rear guards destroyed the last bridges over the Taedong and set off final demolitions in the sections of Pyongyang below the river. Colonel Stebbins, Walker's G4, who supervised the removal of material from Chinampo and Pyongyang, would have preferred a slower move by 72 or even 48 hours. Given that additional time, Stebbins believed, the service troops could have removed most of the 8,000 to 10,000 tons of supplies and equipment that now lay abandoned and broken up or burning inside of Pyongyang. You heard that right. Almost no enemy contact. What's that all about? Aren't the Chinese pushing 8th Army anymore? Aren't they going for the kill? Well, it is not only the UN forces who have suffered recently, and the deeper south the Chinese push, the worse things are getting for them. Supply continues to be their biggest issue. They do have the equipment stocks, but they struggle to get stuff to the front. In terms of manpower, of course, their reserves are incredibly deep, even with their nation recovering from civil war. In truth, their victory in the recent offensive was more or less accomplished by manpower alone. The Chinese soldiers have proved to be more than a match for their Korean and Western counterparts, man for man. Many American soldiers know little about the Chinese beyond the racial stereotypes that exist back in the States. Some truly expected the Chinese to be little more than deferential little dudes who had never seen a truck or a tank before. The Chinese they met north of the Chongchon were instead well-built and experienced veterans, many of them 6 feet plus, rushing at them with guns blazing, ready to get point blank with their American adversaries and tackle them with their fists instead of their rifles. However, the Chinese have not been able to bring up their artillery to properly support their assault, and the cold is now starting to bite into them harder than it is the Americans. Many Chinese have good winter weather gear, sure, we saw that a few weeks back, but the clothes on their back are really all they have to fight against frostbite. If it gets wet, they find themselves at the mercy of the cold when they stop moving for the day. Also, the UN troops regularly eat hot cooked meals. The Chinese take their rations cold. Many UN troops sleep in heavy sleeping bags, while the Chinese must make do with their jackets, and they are unable to risk lighting fires and announcing their location to the UN artillery and air power. And that UN air power is really starting to take its toll on the Chinese supply network. As they've gone further south, huge numbers of Chinese troops have now moved out of the hills, and their supply lines are finally visible and finally vulnerable to air attack. Their wounded need to be evacuated. Broken equipment needs to be replaced. Ammo needs to be replenished. And this, they now have a seriously hard time doing. They lack radar and radio. So what does the Chinese air defense network look like? Well, its sentries along the roads, literally every couple hundred meters, ready with a whistle and a rifle to alert the passing trucks if they hear the sounds of planes overhead. Even so, supply can only really move safely at night. Great columns of men and trucks moved south across the Yalu each night, backs bent and springs groaning under their burdens. They learned to place wide brooms on the front of vehicles to sweep aside the puncture nails dropped on the roads by U.S. aircraft. They organized emergency repair parties to replace broken bridges and ruined roads within hours, but the Chinese were never able effectively to deploy artillery in support of their advance. Probably the most critical contribution of American air power in the Korean War was the interdiction of supply routes during the winter battles of 1950. This alone, it may be argued, prevented the Chinese from converting the defeat of the UN forces into their destruction. In the eastern half of Korea, the U.S. Marines are still dealing with the aftershocks of the fight at the Chosin Reservoir. Pretty much all of the UN forces that haven't been killed or captured have by now managed to make it to Hagaru. Remember that airstrip southwest of the town that the engineers were expanding? Well, at the end of last week, on the 1st, a C-47 managed to land there, even though the work was really only about halfway done, and the evacuation of wounded began. By the 5th, they've managed to evacuate some 4,300 casualties by air and flown in 500 fresh troops. A total evacuation by air is considered and would seem possible, for the Chinese have been basically silent in this sector since their brutal assaults were pushed back the first few days of battle. 1st Marine Division Commander O.P. Smith is in Hagaru himself leading the defense and the withdrawal, and he actually declines the offer of an evacuation by air. He knows they'd be forced to leave most of their equipment behind, and he is simply not willing to do that. The future of the fight in Korea is unclear, and the only certainty is it's going to be a lot harder than they believed a few weeks ago. At a time like this, he feels he can't afford to throw away the equipment of two of the most capable American regiments, the 5th and 7th Marines. The Marines will try to fight their way out and bring whatever they can with them. The rest will be destroyed. For all of his earlier squabbles with Smith, 10th Corps Commander Ned Almond approves and applauds this decision. The order to begin the withdrawal is issued the 5th, and the first troops move out of Hagaru the next morning. They're fighting their way towards Koto-ri, where they can link up with Chesty Puller's 1st Marines, and then all push to the Hamhung-Hongnam perimeter together. Small arms fire and mortar attacks do slow their progress, but with heavy air cover, artillery support, and tanks leading the way, they make good ground. After they get south of the valley where Task Force Drysdale was ambushed last week, now called Hellfire Valley by the Royal Marines, enemy resistance dies down, and by the end of the 7th, they've made it to Koto-ri with about 600 casualties, just over 100 of them dead. From here, they move out along with Puller's crews south towards Chinhongni. The Marines are starting to enter U.S. 3rd Division sector and can expect help from them. They get it, too. Elements of 3rd Division, along with a battalion of Marines attached to them, push north out of Chinhongni to secure the high ground overlooking the withdrawal. The Chinese, mainly the PVA 60th Division, offer moderate to heavy resistance, but again, air power and artillery support from 3rd Division keep the road mostly clear. At this pace, they expect to reach Chinhongni tomorrow the 11th, and from there, trucks should be available to carry some of, if not all of them, the rest of the way. The Chosin nightmare seems almost over. But there are other nightmares brewing back on the home front. After the Chinese advance began, UN Commander Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo became inundated with reporters and journalists all clamoring for his thoughts. Of course, one topic was bound to come up: the atomic option. This is a conversation between Mac and a magazine reporter. Question: can anything be said as to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the bomb in the type of operations in which you are now engaged? Answer: my comment at this time would be inappropriate. Question: in the type of warfare now going on in Korea, are there large enough concentrations of enemy troops to make the bomb effective? Answer: my comment at this time would be inappropriate. What MacArthur says here, or refuses to say, leaves little to the imagination. But this is not too surprising. He has always had a talent for saying the unsayable. The real shock came back on November 30th, when U.S. President Harry Truman allowed himself to be baited into commenting on the issue. Asked by a reporter whether the atomic option had been considered, Truman replied there was active consideration of every weapon at the U.S. disposal, including atomic bombs. Now this really was alarming to many, both inside and outside the U.S. But with the Americans still reeling from the shock of the new battlefield reality, it is the British who seize the initiative here and decide it's time for a chat about the direction things are headed. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and the British Chiefs of Staff fly to Washington this week and meet with Truman and his own chiefs starting December 5th. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson is acutely aware of the sensitivity of this meeting. The British might be a junior partner in the war, with only a couple of brigades deployed, but Britain remains America's closest ally, and the number 2 anti-communist power in the world today. Their involvement and their support helps legitimize American action in Korea as a UN intervention, because without them, it becomes an exercise in American imperialism. The Americans walk into this conference knowing that some concessions will have to be made, because spooking the British into retracting their support, or worse, pushing them into opposition, would be diplomatically disastrous. For the British, they're concerned that with the arrival of the Chinese, the UN mission in Korea is going to end up costing the West more than victory would gain them, especially if things escalate further. They believe that the Americans are still fighting the wrong enemy, and that their focus should be on the USSR, not communist China. China is distinct from the USSR, not one of Stalin's puppets. This is something the British repeatedly emphasize at the meeting. They discuss the war, with British Field Marshal Bill Slim, now Chief of the Imperial General Staff, getting into the details with U.S. Secretary of Defense George Marshall. The mood of the meeting is sometimes bitter, bordering on acrimonious, with the British openly questioning American competence, and the Americans appalled that their interests and methods are being questioned. They discussed the shift to the defensive, and after much back and forth, agreed that Korea will not be abandoned voluntarily. The Americans will fight until pushed out, and the British will be there alongside them. Attlee gets the assurances he wants from Truman later in the meeting, namely that the British will be consulted before any operation to deploy an atomic bomb, and also before any further expansion of the war. MacArthur is also discussed at length, with the British expressing their anxieties about his command, specifically that they consider him too much of a maverick to abide by these new agreements. The discussion tapers off without a real conclusion, but the Americans were, in fact, very much listening to this. And with that, I end the week. The Marines are slowly edging closer to safety, and 8th Army at least now has some kind of cohesion. Supported from the air, the UN retreat is at least looking feasible. But how far will they retreat? To the 38th parallel? To Seoul? All the way back to the Naktong River again? Well, whatever line they choose to hold, they will need to pick their battles carefully. The Truman administration will also need to tread carefully to avoid the UN mission coming apart. Today, I will leave you with this from T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War. For the first time, the UN cloak that the United States government had so expeditiously woven for its action in Korea became not a support, but a hindrance. The UN in June had been almost wholly responsive to American leadership, and the United States had chosen to implement its national policy under the aegis of the UN, at the time a great moral victory. With the entry of Red China into the fighting, the sharp U.S. setback in the north, and the prospect of an enlarged war yawning ominously, the nations composing the UN suddenly became restive. American leadership, unfortunately, had lost a great deal of its prestige on the battlefield. Well, the decisions taken now and in the next few weeks are critical to the future of the UN intervention. The battlefield situation must be stabilized, and doubts and anxieties must quickly be laid to rest, because, for the first time since the beginning of the war, the doubters are shouting louder than the believers. For nearly 6 months, I've covered this conflict week by week as it's raged, and I can continue to do that thanks to the Time Ghost Army, for it is the Army that supports all of our productions. Cameron Goff is the Time Ghost Army Member of the Week, and these are the newest commissioned officers. I almost forgot what I was going to say there, but these are the newest commissioned officers. And you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.